Have you ever felt a moment so still, so heavy with meaning, that you knew, without a doubt, you were not alone? I am not speaking of noise or spectacle, not thunder from the heavens or fire from the sky. I am speaking of something deeper, something that reaches the soul before the mind can catch up. When God is near, something happens inside a human heart, and life is never the same again. There are moments when God draws close, and the air feels different. You may be sitting in a crowded room, or walking alone in the silence of night, yet suddenly your heart becomes aware of eternity. You were thinking about tomorrow, about bills, about worries, but now your thoughts turn upward. That is no accident. God does not stumble into our lives by chance. When He is near, He makes Himself known. One of the first signs is conviction. Not condemnation, not shame meant to crush you, but a gentle, holy awareness that something must change. You begin to see your life as it truly is. The excuses fade, the masks fall. You recognize habits that once seemed harmless now weigh heavily on your conscience. This is not the voice of the world, and it is not your imagination. When God is near, He speaks to the heart and reveals truth, not to destroy you, but to restore you. Another sign is an unexplainable hunger. Suddenly, the things that once satisfied you no longer do. Success feels empty. Pleasure feels temporary. Applause fades too quickly. You begin to hunger for something eternal, something pure. You may not even know how to name it, but your soul aches for God. This hunger is a gift. It is heaven's way of calling you home. When God is near, prayer changes. Words may fail you, but your heart begins to speak. A tear becomes a prayer. A sigh becomes a prayer. Even silence becomes a prayer. You realize that God is not far away, not distant, not uninterested. He is closer than your next breath. You begin to talk to Him, not out of habit, but out of need. And in those quiet moments, you sense that He is listening. Peace is another unmistakable sign. Not the absence of trouble, but the presence of assurance. Storms may rage around you, yet inside there is a calm you cannot explain. Doctors may bring difficult reports. Doors may close. People may disappoint you. But somehow deep within, you know you are held. When God is near, He does not always remove the storm, but He calms the heart within it. When God draws close, love begins to change. Old bitterness loses its grip. Forgiveness, once impossible, becomes possible. You begin to see people not as enemies, but as souls hurting, broken, searching, just like you. Pride starts to loosen its hold. Compassion rises where anger once lived. This is not human strength. This is divine work. There is also a renewed sensitivity to truth. You hear words that you have heard 100 times before, yet suddenly they pierce your heart. Scripture comes alive. A simple message strikes you with power. You realize that God has been speaking all along, but now your ears are open. When God is near, truth no longer feels distant, it feels personal. Many people expect God's nearness to feel dramatic, but often it feels gentle, like a whisper rather than a shout, like a hand on your shoulder rather than a force pushing you forward. He does not overwhelm, He invites. He does not coerce, He calls. And the greatest miracle is not what happens around you, but what happens within you. You may begin to feel a burden for others, not out of guilt, but out of love. You care about souls. You care about eternity. You begin to realize that life is more than time. It is preparation for forever. When God is near, your vision lifts from the temporary to the eternal. And yes, sometimes God's nearness exposes pain you have buried for years. Old wounds resurface. Tears flow unexpectedly. But do not fear this moment. A surgeon must expose the wound before healing can begin. God never reveals pain to abandon you. He reveals it to heal you. If you are sensing these signs, this conviction, this hunger, this peace, this love, this awareness, do not ignore them. Heaven is knocking on your heart. God is nearer than you think. He is not waiting for you to become perfect. He is waiting for you to come as you are. Some will say, I am too far gone. Others will say, maybe later, but later is not promised. The nearness of God is a sacred moment, and moments pass. Today, if your heart feels stirred, respond. Open your life to Him. Surrender is not loss, it is freedom. When God is near, miracles happen. Not just miracles of the body, but miracles of the soul. Broken lives are made whole. Chains fall. Hope is reborn. Eternity touches time. Do not walk away from this moment unchanged. God is calling, not with anger, but with love. Not with judgment, but with grace. He is near, and when God is near, everything can change. When God draws near, the heart becomes deeply aware of truth and conviction in a way that cannot be ignored or explained away. It is not a sudden fear or a crushing sense of guilt, but a quiet, penetrating awareness that reaches beyond surface behavior and settles into the deepest parts of the soul. Things that once seemed acceptable begin to feel heavy. Words spoken carelessly echo longer than before. Actions that were easily justified now stand exposed in the light of truth. This conviction does not come from human reasoning or social pressure. It comes from the presence of God revealing what has always been there but hidden. In that moment, excuses lose their power. The mind can no longer silence the heart. A person begins to see themselves honestly, without comparison to others, without hiding behind accomplishments or failures. There is a realization that God is not concerned with appearances, but with the condition of the heart. Pride weakens, and self-deception fades. What once felt normal begins to feel misaligned, not because of rules imposed from the outside, but because the soul senses it was created for something higher. This awareness often arrives quietly. It may come during a simple conversation, a moment of solitude, or even in the middle of a busy day. There is no warning, no dramatic sign, yet the inner world shifts. A person may feel a sudden heaviness mixed with clarity, a sorrow mixed with hope. It is the understanding that something is not as it should be, but also the knowledge that change is possible. Conviction carries both truth and invitation. As God draws closer, the heart becomes sensitive. The conscience awakens. What was once ignored now speaks loudly. There is a new attentiveness to thoughts, attitudes, and motives. Not just what is done, but why it is done. The heart recognizes selfishness, bitterness, and pride not as small flaws, but as barriers to true life. This recognition is uncomfortable, yet strangely freeing, because truth always brings freedom, even when it exposes what is painful. In this state, many feel an inner struggle. The old way of living resists the light, while the soul longs to move toward it. Memories surface. Regrets come into focus. Choices made long ago feel present again. This is not meant to paralyze, but to awaken. God's nearness pulls the heart out of numbness and into awareness. A numb heart cannot change, but an awakened heart can. Conviction also brings humility. The need to prove oneself fades. The desire to appear strong diminishes. There is a growing understanding that nothing is hidden from God and nothing needs to be. This humility opens the door to honesty, and honesty opens the door to transformation. The heart begins to desire alignment rather than approval, truth rather than comfort. When God draws near, conviction is accompanied by a quiet sense of mercy. Even as faults are revealed, there is an underlying assurance that exposure is not rejection. The heart senses that God already knows everything and has drawn near anyway. This realization breaks resistance. It becomes clear that conviction is not God pushing someone away, but God inviting them closer. This awareness changes how life is viewed. The heart begins to weigh things differently. Temporary pleasures lose their shine. Shallow victories feel empty. There is a longing for integrity, for purity, for a life that reflects truth rather than hides from it. The soul understands that real life begins not with self-justification, but with surrender. As conviction deepens, it creates space for repentance, not as a ritual, but as a turning of the heart. There is a desire to move away from what harms and toward what heals. This turning is not forced, it is drawn by love. The heart responds not because it is afraid of punishment, but because it has tasted the nearness of God and does not want to lose it. In that sacred awareness, the heart stands at a threshold, fully seen, fully known, and quietly invited to step into truth. A supernatural hunger for eternity begins to rise when God draws near, and it cannot be satisfied by anything the world has to offer. Things that once felt fulfilling slowly lose their grip. Achievements that once brought pride feel shallow. Distractions that once filled the day no longer quiet the soul. There is an inner restlessness that does not come from dissatisfaction with life, but from awakening to something greater than life as it has been lived. The heart begins to sense that it was created for more than survival, more than success, more than fleeting moments of happiness. This hunger often arrives unexpectedly. A person may be surrounded by comfort, yet feel empty. They may have reached goals they once prayed for, yet feel an ache they cannot explain. The world continues to offer noise, entertainment, and escape, but the soul grows tired of substitutes. There is a growing awareness that nothing temporary can satisfy an eternal soul. This awareness is not learned, it is revealed when God comes close. As this hunger deepens, the heart begins to seek meaning beyond the surface. Questions about purpose, destiny, and eternity grow louder. A person begins to think not only about today, but about what lasts. The rush of life slows, and moments of reflection increase. Silence becomes valuable. Solitude becomes necessary. The soul begins to listen for something beyond the voices of the world. This longing is not a rejection of life, but a reordering of desire. The heart does not lose interest in living. It gains clarity about why it lives. Ambition shifts. Goals are re-examined. The pursuit of pleasure gives way to the pursuit of truth. What once seemed urgent now seems trivial. What once seemed distant now feels essential. Eternity moves from an abstract idea to a personal reality. With this hunger comes a growing awareness of God's presence. The heart begins to recognize moments where heaven feels close. A simple word carries weight. A quiet moment carries meaning. The soul feels drawn upward, not by fear, but by love. This longing is gentle yet persistent, reminding the heart that it belongs to something greater than the present moment. The hunger for eternity also exposes the limits of self-sufficiency. A person begins to realize that they cannot fill this longing on their own. Control loses its illusion. Independence feels incomplete. The soul recognizes its dependence on God, not as weakness, but as design. This realization brings humility and openness, allowing the heart to receive rather than strive. As God remains near, this hunger becomes a guiding force. Choices begin to reflect eternal values rather than temporary gain. Time is spent more intentionally. Relationships are viewed through a deeper lens. The heart desires alignment with what matters beyond this life. There is a growing sensitivity to how actions echo into eternity. This longing does not bring despair, it brings hope. The awareness of eternity lifts the heart above the pressures of the present. Suffering is seen in a new light. Joy becomes deeper, not because circumstances change, but because perspective does. The soul begins to understand that life is not random and pain is not wasted. The hunger for eternity is not meant to torment the heart, but to lead it home. It is a divine invitation written into the soul, calling it to lift its eyes beyond the temporary and toward what is everlasting. When God draws near, this hunger becomes impossible to ignore, quietly shaping the heart toward what it was always meant to seek. When God draws near, prayer is no longer a religious habit or a collection of memorized words, but a living connection that flows from the deepest places of the heart. The pressure to speak correctly fades, and the need to be honest takes its place. Words become fewer, yet meaning becomes deeper. A person realizes that God is not impressed by eloquence, but moved by sincerity. In that awareness, prayer becomes less about performance and more about presence. Often this change begins quietly. A person may attempt to pray as they always have, only to find themselves pausing, searching, listening. Silence becomes comfortable rather than awkward. There is a growing sense that God is near enough to hear the unspoken. Thoughts, emotions, and burdens rise to the surface without effort. Prayer becomes a place of refuge rather than obligation. As God's nearness increases, the heart learns that tears can speak when words cannot. A sigh carries meaning. A whisper carries weight. Even exhaustion becomes a form of prayer. The soul understands that God listens not only to language, but to longing. This realization removes fear and invites openness. The heart begins to bring everything into prayer, not just what seems acceptable. Prayer also becomes more honest. There is less hiding and less pretending. Doubts are no longer suppressed, and fears are no longer masked. The heart discovers that God is not threatened by questions or discomfort. Bringing weakness into prayer becomes an act of trust. The soul learns that prayer is not about appearing strong before God, but about allowing God to be strong within. As this communion deepens, prayer begins to shape the heart. Desires are examined. Motives are revealed. The soul becomes aware of what truly matters. Requests begin to change, not because God demands it, but because closeness transforms perspective. The heart starts to desire alignment rather than answers, nearness rather than outcomes. When God is near, prayer becomes a two-way exchange. Listening grows as important as speaking. The heart becomes attentive to subtle impressions, gentle convictions, quiet assurances. There is an awareness that God speaks not always through sound, but through peace, clarity, and direction. The soul learns to wait, trusting that silence is not absence, but presence. This shift in prayer also affects daily life. Conversations with God no longer feel confined to specific moments or places. Prayer weaves itself into ordinary moments. Walking, working, resting, and waiting become opportunities for connection. The boundary between sacred and ordinary begins to fade. Life itself becomes a conversation with God. As prayer becomes more relational, it also becomes more dependent. The heart recognizes its need for guidance, strength, and wisdom. Self-reliance weakens and surrender strengthens. There is a growing comfort in bringing uncertainty to God rather than trying to resolve it alone. Prayer becomes a place where burdens are released rather than carried. In this closeness, prayer loses urgency, driven by fear, and gains persistence rooted in trust. The soul prays not to convince God to act, but because it knows God is already at work. Waiting becomes part of prayer. Trust becomes part of prayer. The heart rests in the knowledge that being heard is more important than being answered immediately. This transformation in prayer is not sudden or dramatic, but steady and deep. Over time, the heart realizes that prayer has become less about changing circumstances and more about changing the one who prays. In the nearness of God, prayer becomes the place where the soul is shaped, strengthened, and quietly held. When God draws near, an unexplainable peace settles into the heart, a peace that does not depend on circumstances or outcomes. Life may remain uncertain, problems unresolved, and questions unanswered. Yet beneath it all there is a steady calm that cannot be shaken. This peace does not deny reality or ignore pain. It coexists with it. It is the assurance that even in chaos, nothing is out of God's control. This peace often arrives when it seems least logical. A person may be facing loss, disappointment, or fear, yet find themselves able to breathe deeply again. The mind may still wrestle with concerns, but the heart is no longer ruled by them. There is a quiet confidence that does not come from understanding, but from trust. When God is near, the heart learns to rest without having every answer. As this peace grows, fear begins to lose its authority. Anxiety no longer dominates every thought. Worry may knock, but it does not stay. The soul becomes anchored to something deeper than emotion. This peace acts as a guard over the heart, keeping it from being overwhelmed by what could happen or what might be lost. The storm may continue, but the inner world is steadied. This calm reshapes perspective. Problems are no longer viewed as final, but as temporary. The heart begins to understand that life is bigger than the present moment. Pain is still painful, but it no longer defines everything. There is room to hope again. There is space to believe that even difficult seasons have purpose beyond what can be seen. When God is near, this peace creates strength rather than passivity. It does not lead to withdrawal or indifference. Instead, it gives courage to face what must be faced. Decisions are made with clarity rather than panic. Words are spoken with grace rather than fear. The heart remains steady even when emotions rise and fall. This peace also brings a sense of being held. The soul feels secure, not because life is safe, but because God is faithful. There is an awareness that one is not walking through hardship alone. Even in moments of isolation, the heart knows it is accompanied. This nearness transforms loneliness into quiet companionship. As peace deepens, it affects relationships and reactions. The urge to control outcomes weakens. The need to defend oneself softens. The heart becomes slower to anger and quicker to listen. Peace shapes responses, allowing gentleness to replace urgency. The presence of God within begins to reflect outwardly through calmness and patience. This inner calm becomes a refuge during uncertainty. When plans fail and expectations collapse, peace remains. The soul learns that security is not found in predictability, but in presence. Trust grows not because life becomes easier, but because God becomes closer. Over time, this peace teaches endurance. The heart learns how to wait without despair. Delays no longer feel like abandonment. Silence no longer feels like absence. The soul remains grounded, believing that timing and purpose are held by hands wiser than its own. When God draws near, peace becomes a living testimony. Others notice it, even if they cannot explain it. It speaks without words, pointing to a source beyond human strength. This peace becomes a quiet witness, declaring that hope is alive even in the darkest valleys. This unexplainable peace does not remove hardship, but it changes how hardship is carried, allowing the heart to stand firm while the world around it continues to shake. When God is near, life is no longer measured only by what is seen, felt, or achieved. Something deeper takes hold of the heart, reshaping priorities, desires, and direction. The nearness of God does not always announce itself with signs and wonders, yet its impact is undeniable. It leaves a mark on the soul that cannot be erased by time, trouble, or circumstance. A person may walk back into the same world, face the same responsibilities, and encounter the same challenges, but they are no longer the same within. The greatest miracle of God's nearness is transformation. Hearts once hardened begin to soften. Lives once driven by fear begin to move with faith. The restless search for meaning gives way to a quiet assurance that life has purpose beyond the present moment. God's presence does not erase human weakness, but it fills weakness with strength. It does not remove uncertainty, but it replaces despair with hope. When God draws near, the soul begins to understand that it was never meant to carry life alone. The burden of self-sufficiency loosens. The pressure to have all the answers fades. Trust replaces control, and surrender becomes a place of peace rather than loss. The heart learns that God's closeness is not earned by effort, but received through openness. This nearness also brings clarity. What truly matters comes into focus. What once seemed important loses its urgency. Eternity steps into the present, shaping decisions, relationships, and values. Life is no longer lived only for today, but in light of what lasts forever. Even pain begins to carry meaning when it is held in the presence of God. God's nearness is not reserved for the strong or the righteous. It is offered to the weary, the broken, the uncertain, and the searching. It meets people where they are, not where they pretend to be. There is no distance too great, no past too heavy, no failure too final to place someone beyond the reach of God's presence. He draws near not to condemn, but to restore. If the heart has been stirred, if conviction has awakened, if hunger has risen, if peace has settled in unexpected ways, these are not coincidences. They are invitations. God does not force his way into a life. He waits for a response. The nearness of God is a sacred moment, one that calls for humility, honesty, and faith. Life will continue to bring storms, questions, and seasons of waiting. But when God is near, the heart is anchored. Hope endures. Strength renews. The soul finds rest not in answers, but in presence. This nearness becomes the foundation on which everything else stands. In the end, the greatest assurance a person can have is not that life will be easy, but that God is close. His presence changes everything it touches. When God is near, fear loses its grip, purpose comes alive, and eternity begins to shape the present. This is the invitation set before every heart to step out of distance and into nearness, to move from striving to surrender, and to discover that being close to God is where life truly begins